Good morning. Glad to see everybody this morning. We are going to be in Judges quite a bit this morning. So if you have your Bibles marked there, Judges chapter 15, go ahead and mark them if you don't have them marked. We are looking, if you were following along in Judges chapter 15, we see an amazing feat by a man named Samson. We probably have all read about Samson or heard about Samson. It's one of the stories that we hear about growing up in our kids' classes, and we love the almost superhuman feat that Samson can do, the superhuman strength that Samson had been given by God. But what I want to talk about a little bit in today's lesson is not his strength. But in spite of all his strength, he had many weaknesses. We read about Samson and the end of his life and basically him dying amongst the enemies of God's people, and it was because of bad choices that Samson made. Samson is considered, if not the strongest man in the Bible, possibly the strongest man who ever lived. Think about that for a moment. There's been a lot of people who have done some pretty amazing things athletically or with weightlifting. But imagine that times whatever Samson had. Some of the amazing feats that Samson did. He carried a city gate 16 miles. Now, this is not an easy thing. And again, if you look, it's probably at minimum 16 miles, because where he begins and where he ends up is actually more like 37 miles apart. But the actual verbiage suggests that maybe he dropped the gate along the way. But we're talking about a city gate that in most conservative estimates probably weighed at least 500-600 pounds. And I'll just tell you that Braden and I helped my dad carry a gun safe yesterday. It was about 700 pounds, and I couldn't have carried it 16 inches, let alone 16 miles to drop it somewhere. It was heavy. But most estimates are in the thousands of pounds, even upward to 10,000 pounds. These city gates were gigantic because they're basically the last little bit of protection for the city, both coming in and even going out. These things were huge, and most of them were gigantic, like cedar beams or trees covered in metal that would add a lot of weight to it. And so this was heavy, and he was able to carry it approximately 16 miles. In this account that was read for us by Gary, if you were following along, we see that he killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. Now imagine that, just coming upon this group of 1,000 men that's ready and willing to take your life, and looking down and maybe seeing a dead donkey and ripping its jawbone off to use it to defend yourself and kill 1,000 men with it. In Judges chapter 14, verses 5 and 6, it talks about him ripping a lion apart with his bare hands. And then at his death, in Judges chapter 16 and verse 30, he says, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bent with all his might so that the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed in his life. And we know that he killed a lot of men in his life. But it says in his death, apparently there were more men there than he had killed combined throughout his life. And so this is a large building that he was basically suspended between these two pillars and was able to knock this entire structure down with his bare hands. Now, how does someone who is so strong get to a point in his life that is still so strong? How does he get to a point in his life where he is going to die, and not just die, but he says, let me die with the Philistines. He's going to die with the enemies of God's people. And I want to suggest to you today that it was his weakness that led him to that. You know, we like to look and hone in on the strengths of Samson, but today, as a strong man, I want to look at his weaknesses. Number one, as strong as Samson was, Samson could not overcome the bad companions that he hung out with. And so again, we'll make spiritual application for ourselves. Just as Samson was kind of brought down by the people that he hung around with, we too can be brought down by the people that we choose to have as our companions. Now, Judges 14, verse 1, it says, then Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. And so he looks at this woman who's an enemy of God's people, who God had told them not to intermarry with. They shouldn't have even left them alive, but told them not to intermarry with. And he sees this woman and wants to have her as his wife. And so I say that Judges chapter 14, verse 1 is right both geographically, that he would have had to have gone down to get there, but it is also correct spiritually that he had to go down to get there. And again, I'm not saying that Christians are better than other people, but again, if we spiritually have to go down often to be around the people that we want to be around with, we may want to take inventory of who we're trying to be around, because it didn't do Samson much good. The woman is described as a harlot of Timnah. We see later on Delilah of Sorek, whom he was again enamored with, who again was not an Israelite, but one of the enemies of God's people. We will be judged by whom we associate with. In Amos chapter 3 and verse 3, do two men walk together unless they have made an appointment or have a union of some sort, have a dual between them, have the same mindset? That's what Amos chapter 3 is suggesting. He says, you know, if you're walking with someone, if you have something in common with someone, if it's somebody that's not maybe right in what they're thinking, not someone that is thinking very spiritually, if we can continually find ourselves around people or with people that do not have a spiritual mindset, we may have been choosing the wrong companions, the wrong people. In James chapter 4 and verse 4, you adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Now, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have people who are not Christians as friends. I think that there's many cases where the friends who are around us are going to become Christians at some point because of our influence or because of our teaching. And so I think it's certainly a good thing, but we're talking about people who do not have a spiritual mindset, that do not have God in their heart and God in their mind. And even in the other case, even people who are good people who aren't Christians, if we have got so many of those and so few Christian friends, at some point their influence is going to overtake us. As Christians, we need to have a gravity toward light. We should be gravitating toward people who are very spiritual, people who are believers in God. In Matthew chapter 5, it says, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are a light. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. We choose companions from those that we associate with, from those people that we are around most often. Those are typically who becomes our friends, our lifelong friends. Are we putting more people in our lives and around our family? And again, just as an example, if I choose to bring in amongst myself all of these non-Christian people, these non-believers who are not very good, imagine the influence that has on my wife. Imagine the influence that has on my children. And those things can happen very, very quickly. In Judges chapter 14, we read about Samson. Again, Samson went down to Timnah, saw the woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistine. So he came back and told his father and mother, I saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife. His father and mother said to him, is there no woman among the daughters of your relatives or among our people that you should go take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she looks good to me. However, his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, for he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. Now at that time, the Philistines were ruling over Israel. Again, as we see this all part of God's plan, and God was going to use this, it doesn't mean that this is what Samson should be doing. You know, his father and mother were right to say, hey, maybe look for somebody who believes more like you do, who's not an enemy of God, but a believer in God. 2 Corinthians 6 tells us, do not be bound together with unbelievers, for what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness? He says, you shouldn't even be considering this, because you shouldn't have anything in common. And if we continue to take people as our companions who are not very godly, eventually we will become more like them. I believe that as strong as Samson was, Samson could not control his emotions. I mean, this man is so strong, so powerful that he can kill 1,000 men, but he can't control his lust. He cannot control his anger. He cannot control the revenge that is in his heart. And again, we'll look at examples of each. In Proverbs chapter 16, in verse 32, we're warned about anger. He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who captures a city. He's basically saying you're stronger than Samson if you can control your anger. This is like literally what that's about. Here's a man who captured cities. Here's a man who was so mighty that he could kill 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. It wasn't even really a weapon. But he says, if you're slow to anger, you're mightier than him. If you rule your spirit, if you rule your life, if you make the right decisions, he said, you've got a leg up on somebody who can capture an entire city. And in Judges chapter 14, we read of that. We read of how ruthless Samson could be. Then Samson said to them, let me now propound a riddle to you. If you indeed tell it to me within 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen wraps and 30 changes of clothes. But if you are unable to tell me, then you shall give me 30 linen wraps and 30 changes of clothes. And they said to him, propound your riddle that we may hear it. And he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. So he gives them the riddle, but they could not tell the riddle in 3 days. Then it came about on the 4th day that they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband so that he will tell us the riddle, or we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us to impoverish us? Is this not so? Samson's wife wept before him and said, you hate me and do not love me, and have propounded a riddle to the sons of my people and have not told me. And he said to her, behold, I have not told it to my father or mother. Should I tell you? However, she wept before him 7 days while their feast lasted. And on the 7th day he told her, because she pressed him so hard. She then told the riddle to the sons of her people. So the men of that city said to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, what is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion? And he said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. Meaning, if you had not asked my wife or enticed my wife, you would not have found out my riddle. Now look at his reaction. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of them and took their spoil and gave the changes of clothes to those who told the riddle. And his anger burned, and he went up to his father's house. But Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his friend. Now, this is not the work of a patient man. This is not the work of a man who has control over his anger, is it? It falls right in line with the idea of revenge. Now, Romans chapter 12 tells us never take your own revenge, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. You know, oftentimes we do something that we should not do or we would not normally do because we are angry, because we want to take revenge on our enemies. Samson believed that it was his right to not only, he was going to fulfill his promise to give them 30 changes of clothes and 30 linen wraps, but he didn't want to give it of his own, and so he goes out and kills 30 people to do it. And in Judges chapter 15, when he came to Lehi, starting in verse 14, the Philistines shouted as they met him, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, so that the ropes who were on his arms were as flax, and were burned with fire, and his bonds dropped from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey. He reached out and took it and killed 1,000 men with it. Here's the revenge for trying to tie him up, for trying to take his strength away. With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I've killed 1,000 men. When he had finished speaking, he threw the jawbone from his hand and named that place Ramath Lehi. Then he became very thirsty and called upon the Lord. You have given this great deliverance by your hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised. But God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, so that water came out of it. When he drank, his strength returned, and he revived. Therefore he named it En Keptor, which is in Lehi to this day. So he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. See, he believed that it was his right to take vengeance on himself and not leave room for the vengeance of God. He also could not control the lust that was in his heart for several women who were in his life. In Matthew chapter 5, in verse 28, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust in his heart has committed adultery with her already. And think about that. We talked about that a little bit this morning, that it's not just the act, but it's the heart. It's the having that mindset of if I had an opportunity, I would take advantage of it. We see him in Judges chapter 16 again. Now Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went to her. When it was told the Gazites, saying, Samson has come, they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. And they kept silent, saying, let us wait until morning, then we will kill him. Here, these people wanted to kill him, and he gives them opportunity because of the lust that was in his heart. He goes into this harlot who is there. Samson could not control himself. Even though he could control other people by force, he could not control himself and the lust that was in his heart. Do we get to that point? Are we able to control the lust that is in our heart? Samson was unable to. We should not put ourselves in the situations that Samson put himself in. Because as strong as Samson was, he could not overcome temptation. In James chapter 4, there's an interesting verse in verse 7 that says, submit therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Here's what I'm going to suggest to you about Samson. As strong as he was, Satan never left him. It seems that throughout his life, Satan is there again and again and again. That he is constantly there. Because he never resisted. Now, the Nazirite vow, which Samson was a part of, now, not many people were fulfilling the Nazirite vow from birth. But during the vow period, many people went and did the Nazirite vow, but it was only for a short period of time. But during that time, the person was supposed to abstain from strong drink. They were supposed to leave their hair uncut throughout the vow, which again we see Samson was meant to be from birth to death a Nazirite. So abstain from strong drink, leave your hair uncut throughout the vow, and have no contact with a dead body, whether that was a carcass of an animal or whether that was the carcass of a human, a relative. You were supposed to abstain from contact. And as far as we can read through scriptures, he broke all three, and likely multiple times. Think about a man who is going through this Nazirite vow, who's not allowed to have contact with a dead carcass, and yet he killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. Do you think he was in contact with a carcass? Yeah, he created those carcasses. He was in contact with the carcass of a lion when he ripped it apart with his bare hands. He too often left God for the comforts of the world. Again, but the question is, what about us? Are we able to overcome temptation? In fact, as we look at what Samson did, Samson actually put himself in the pathway of temptation more often than Satan even had to worry about it. How are we at resisting temptation? How are we at taking ourselves and putting ourselves outside of the path of temptation? Knowing what our weaknesses are, we should avoid things, and it seems that Samson ran toward them. Now, we've said a lot of bad things maybe about Samson today and his inability to not be able to control himself or his emotions. But in Hebrews chapter 11, the heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, as the Hebrew writer is kind of concluding his thoughts and saying, you know what, I could talk so much more about so many more people, and what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fire of power, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty men in war, and put foreign armies to flight. Apparently, at some point, Samson did allow his weaknesses to grow his faith. And I think we should all do the same. Where we see a weakness in our lives, we need to find God. We need to take that weakness and say, God, take over that weakness so that it can become a strength. And if we are without God, then we are without hope. In Ephesians chapter 2, starting in verse 11, therefore remember that formerly you, the Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision which is performed by the flesh of human hands, remember that you were at a time separated from Christ, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. If we continue down the path that Samson continued down throughout his life, it's not going to end in a good place, because it's going to end in a place without God. No hope and without God. But Samson, being named among the heroes of faith with all of the weaknesses that he had, he was still a hero of faith. And so you can be as well. You may look at yourself and say, well, I'm more like Samson than I would like to admit. In some ways, I hope. Because Samson was also a hero of faith. With all of the weaknesses and all of the things that God's Word tells us that he did not do right, he still had hope. because he still had God. And we see him praying at the end of his life for God to give him that strength back for just a moment so that he could die with the enemies of God's people, and God grants him that. Hope awaits you today. If you're not a child of God, you can have hope. Don't have it yet, but you can have hope through God. Just like Samson, who was flawed beyond measure. Even though he was such a strong human being, he was flawed beyond measure, but he still had hope because he still had God. If you're not a child of God this morning, I would encourage you to become one. Put on the name of Christ in baptism and begin walking the path that you should. If you're here and you are a child of God who maybe has once done that, once become a child of God, but yet, as Samson, maybe don't make the right choices, maybe don't walk the path that you should, there's time and opportunity to do that this very morning. If you're here and subject to God's invitation in any way, won't you please come have a front seat?